In 1997, a 26-year-old schoolteacher named Kate Bainbridge caught a virus. It went for her brain. Within days, she was in a coma, and when she surfaced from it, she didn't surface all the way. Her eyes opened, her body was there. But the doctors around her bed made a determination that should chill you more than it usually does. They decided nobody was home. Vegetative state. That was the diagnosis. A body running on its own, with no one inside watching it happen. Here's what almost nobody got to hear, because Kate had no way to tell them. She was awake. Not foggy, not half-present. Awake, aware, trapped behind a face that wouldn't move on command, listening to doctors discuss her like furniture, unable to do a single thing to prove she was still in there. A neuroscientist named Adrian Owen, working out of Cambridge, put her in a brain scanner and showed her photographs of her family. And her brain didn't do what a vegetative brain is supposed to do. It lit up the way yours would, the way mine would. It lit up like somebody was home. Sit with that for a second. Trained physicians, people who spend their careers reading human beings for signs of a mind, stood over her and got it wrong. Not because they were careless, because there is no test for what they were looking for. There never has been. So here's the question I want you to actually carry with you today, not just hear and forget. If doctors with a scanner can stand 2 feet from a conscious human being and be unable to tell if anyone's in there, what makes you so sure about the person sitting across from you right now? The one who raised you? The one you're closest to in the world? The one who just told you they love you? You've never once checked. And it turns out, you can't. I want to be upfront about something because it's going to sound like an exaggeration until I show you it isn't. There is no experiment, no scan, no test that could ever, even in principle, prove that another person has an inner life at all. Not today's technology, not tomorrow's, not any technology anyone can even imagine building. This isn't a gap in our tools. It's a wall built into the shape of the problem itself. The book that sent me down this rabbit hole is called The Conscious Mind, written by a philosopher named David Chalmers. I picked it up expecting a dry academic argument about brains and computers. What I got instead was something that rewired how I look at every single person I've ever trusted. I went in treating this as an interesting puzzle. I came out of it unable to look at another human face without a small, quiet doubt sitting behind my own eyes. I'm not going to pretend I've resolved that doubt. I haven't. I don't think anyone has. Chalmers is the person who gave this problem its sharpest name. He called it the hard problem of consciousness. Not because it's difficult like a math problem is difficult. Hard in the sense of fundamental, load-bearing, maybe unsolvable. And before we're done, I want to show you why he thinks that, why one of the most respected minds in his field thinks he's wrong, and why the disagreement between them still isn't settled. But first, I want to make sure you feel the weight of what's actually being claimed here, because it's easy to hear we can't prove other minds exist and file it under harmless philosophy class trivia. It isn't harmless, and it isn't trivial. So let's slow all the way down and build this from the ground up the way I had to. Start with the one thing you cannot doubt. Not probably can't doubt, cannot. Nearly 400 years ago, a French philosopher named René Descartes set out to find one fact he could be completely certain of. His method was brutal. Doubt everything. Doubt your senses. They've fooled you before. Doubt the room around you. You could be dreaming it. Doubt math itself. What if some deceiver is feeding you false certainties? He stripped away every belief he owned, one at a time, looking for a single plank that wouldn't give way under his own weight. And he found one. Not the world. Not his body. Not even the existence of other people. The one thing that survived total doubt was this: something is doing the doubting. There has to be a you present right now to even ask the question. I think, therefore I am. Cogito, ergo sum. Notice exactly what that proves and exactly what it doesn't. It proves you exist, to yourself. It proves nothing whatsoever about anyone else. Descartes secured one mind with total certainty, his own. Everybody else on earth was left standing outside that circle of certainty, unverified. Read that sentence again, but point it at your own life. You are, at this exact moment, the single confirmed mind in your universe. Everyone else, your parents, your closest friend, the person lying next to you tonight, is outside the wall Descartes built. Not because you don't trust them, because trust was never the kind of thing that could get them inside it. Here's the part that's easy to skate past, so I want to name it directly. This isn't a temporary gap waiting on better instruments. This is what philosophers call the problem of other minds, and it survives every advance in technology because it isn't a technology problem. Your access to your own pain, your own fear, your own love is direct. You don't infer that you're in pain. You simply are, and you know it instantly, with no evidence required. Your access to anyone else's pain is never direct. It always travels through something else first. Their face, their voice, a brain scan, a diary entry. You are reading a signal that arrives from outside. You are never touching the thing itself. A locked diary sitting on a nightstand. That's the shape of it. Your own mind is a book you're reading directly, page by page, in real time, with total access. Everyone else's mind is that same kind of book, except it's locked, and you were never given a key. Only the cover, and whatever you can guess about what's written inside from the way the cover looks. So how do we function at all? How do you get through a single day without collapsing into paranoid uncertainty about everyone around you? There's an answer, and it's a genuinely reasonable one. A British philosopher named John Stuart Mill, writing in the 19th century, laid it out plainly. He noticed that in his own case, certain feelings caused certain behavior. Pain made him wince, joy made him smile. Other people have bodies built the same way his was, and they wince and smile in the same situations he would. So, he reasoned, by analogy, they probably have feelings behind those expressions too, the same way he did. That's not nothing. It's actually the load-bearing reason you're not currently panicking about whether your own mother is conscious. It's a real inference, built on real similarity. Shared biology, shared nervous systems, shared evolutionary history. It is, genuinely, the most reasonable belief available to you. But look closely at what kind of thing it is. It's an inference, a guess, however well-founded. It is not observation. You never got to check the diary. You looked at the cover, noticed it resembled your own, and made a bet. And bets can be wrong. Not usually wrong. You're not being asked to become paranoid about the people in your life. But structurally, in principle, for any single person you've ever met, the bet could fail, and there would be no way, not one, for you to ever find out it had failed. I want to give you a phone call as the image for this because I think it lands harder than the diary does. Imagine you've been talking to someone for years over the phone. You've never met them in person. Every single thing you know about them, their sense of humor, their opinions, the warmth in their voice when they're excited, you built entirely out of patterns and sound coming down a wire. You never once saw them. You inferred a whole person from behavior alone because the behavior was consistent with what a person would produce. Now, here's the uncomfortable turn. That is not a special case. That is the general condition of every relationship you have ever had with everyone, including the people you've hugged, the people whose hands you've held. You've never had more direct access to another mind than that caller on the phone. You've just had better production values, a face instead of a voice, warmth instead of static. But the basic transaction, inferring an inner life from an outer signal, is identical. You have never met anyone. You've only ever heard the call. I told you at the start that I'd come back to something strange. And here it is, a little earlier than I promised, because I want it sitting in your head while we go further. There is a position in philosophy called solipsism. It holds that only your own mind can be known to exist for certain, that everyone and everything else might, for all you can prove, be unconscious scenery. And here's the part that should genuinely unsettle you. Nobody in the history of argument has ever been able to logically disprove it. Not once. It is airtight, and almost no one on earth actually believes it, or lives as though they believe it. We're going to come back to why that gap, a position nobody can refute, that nobody takes seriously, is stranger than it sounds. But not yet. First, I need to show you what happens when you take Mill's phone call logic and push it as far as it will go, because that's where David Chalmers built the argument that started all of this for me. Picture a being that looks exactly like a person, walks like one, talks like one. If you cut them, they flinch and say it hurts. If you tell them a joke, they laugh, and if you ask them later, they'll say they found it funny. Every scan you run on their brain shows the same activity a real person's brain would show in the same moment. There is no measurement, no test, no observation you could ever perform on this being that would come back different from the results you'd get on an actual conscious person. Except there's nobody in there. No experience, no felt quality to any of it. The lights are on, the machinery is running, the outputs are flawless, and there is no one home. David Chalmers calls this a philosophical zombie, not the shambling, hungry kind, a perfect behavioral copy of a conscious being with the inside scooped out. And his argument isn't, maybe these things exist somewhere. His argument is narrower and I think more disturbing. If a being like that is even conceivable, if you can picture it without contradiction, the way you just did, then consciousness can never be fully explained or verified by physical facts and behavior alone. Because here you have all the physical facts, all the behavior, matched perfectly to a real person. And the one thing that matters most, whether it feels like something to be that being, is still completely undetermined. Let that sit for a second, because I think its real force is easy to miss on a first pass. This isn't Chalmers saying, we don't yet have the technology to detect consciousness, but someday we might. He's saying something much colder. No matter how advanced your instruments become, no matter how perfectly you can map a brain down to every neuron and every firing pattern, none of that mapping would, by itself, tell you whether anyone is experiencing it. You could have the complete physical truth about a person's brain in your hands, and the lights on or off question would still be unanswered. He split this into two different problems, and the distinction matters more than almost anything else in this video, so I want to lay it out plainly rather than rushing past it. There are what he calls the easy problems of consciousness, and easy is relative. These are still hard sciences, but they're easy in kind. How does the brain process a face? How does it store a memory? How does it decide to move an arm? These are questions about function, about mechanism, and in principle, you can imagine fully answering them with enough neuroscience. Then there's the hard problem. Why is any of that function accompanied by an experience at all? Why isn't all that processing just happening in the dark with nobody watching it happen? You could explain every gear turning in the machine and never once explain why there's a light on inside it. Here's an image that might make this land better than the jargon does. Think of a light switch on a wall, wired into a bulb you can't see. It's sealed behind frosted glass. You can inspect the wiring all day. You can measure the current, trace every circuit, confirm the switch is functioning exactly as designed. What you cannot do from the wiring alone is confirm whether the bulb behind the glass is actually lit. You're reading the system, you're not reading the light. That's what a brain scan gives you, even the best one ever built. Wiring, function, correlation, never the light itself. Now, I promised I'd be straight with you about where the argument ends and the argument becomes controversial, and this is exactly that seam. So let me mark it clearly. Not everyone agrees the zombie is even a coherent thing to imagine in the first place. A philosopher named Daniel Dennett has spent a large part of his career pushing back hard on Chalmers here, and I want to give his side real room because it's not a fringe objection. It's one of the most serious ongoing fights in the philosophy of mind. Dennett's argument goes something like this. When people imagine a philosophical zombie, they usually imagine something thinner than they realize, a being that acts human in a kind of shallow, scripted way. But push the thought experiment all the way to its actual specification. This being has to be behaviorally identical in every single respect, forever, under every condition. It has to notice when it's injured and adjust its behavior. It has to reflect on its own mental states when asked and describe them convincingly, under pressure, in conversation, for a lifetime. It has to monitor itself the way a person monitors themselves. Dennett gives this fully specified being a name. He calls it a Zimbo. And his claim is that once you actually build the thing all the way out in your imagination, honestly, you've smuggled consciousness back in without noticing. Something that self-monitors, updates, reflects, and reports on its own states that thoroughly isn't obviously distinguishable from a being that's conscious. The zombie you started with quietly stopped being a zombie. So there you have it. Two serious thinkers, two serious camps, and no verdict. Chalmers says, I can conceive of the empty version, therefore consciousness isn't reducible to function. Dennett says, you can't actually conceive of it, not honestly, not all the way through. So the thought experiment doesn't prove what you think it proves. Nobody has settled this. I'm not going to pretend a resolution to that fight because there isn't one. What I want you to take from it isn't a winner. It's this. Even the sharpest minds working on this problem for decades cannot agree on whether the very idea of an empty person is even possible to picture cleanly. If they can't agree on that, you should probably not expect certainty from a glance across a dinner table. Here's where it gets personal again. And I want you to actually do this rather than just hear it. Think of someone specific, not people in general, one person, someone you'd trust with your life. Now ask yourself, honestly, what would be different from where you're standing if they were a zombie? Not what would be different about them, what would be different about your evidence? Their voice would sound the same. Their eyes would still well up at the same memories. They'd still reach for your hand at the same moment they always do. Every single data point available to you would be unchanged. The only thing missing would be the one thing you can never check in the first place. That's not a comforting thought, and I'm not going to pretend it is, but it's also not a reason to start doubting the people in your life. Hold on to that. We're coming back to it properly. For now, I want to take you somewhere Chalmers' thought experiment can't take you because a zombie is imaginary. What I want to show you next actually happened in a hospital to a real person, and it's arguably even stranger than the philosophy, because for once, we actually found a way to peek behind part of the curtain without ever fully getting behind it. Go back to 2006, 9 years after Kate Bainbridge's case. Adrian Owen, the same neuroscientist, was working with a 23-year-old woman who'd been in a car accident and was, by every clinical measure available at the time, in a vegetative state. No response to voices, no response to her name, no reliable, repeatable evidence of anyone tracking what was happening around her. By the standards doctors had to work with, she was exactly the kind of patient Kate had been, a body with the lights off. Owen's team tried something almost absurdly simple. They put her in a scanner and gave her 2 instructions, one at a time. First, imagine playing tennis. Picture yourself swinging a racket, moving across a court, reaching for a ball. Then, separately, imagine walking through the rooms of your own house, one by one, picturing the furniture, the doorways, the layout you know by heart. In a healthy, conscious brain, those 2 tasks light up 2 different well-mapped regions, motor planning areas for the tennis, spatial navigation areas for the house, 2 distinct signatures, easy to tell apart on a scan. They ran the test on this patient, a woman who could not speak, could not gesture, could not so much as blink on command to confirm she understood a single word being said to her. And when they imagined tennis, her motor planning regions lit up. When they imagined the house, her spatial regions lit up. 2 different patterns, on cue, correctly matched to 2 different instructions, indistinguishable from the scans of fully conscious volunteers doing the exact same task in the exact same scanner. Sit with what that actually means. There was no external behavior at all, none by any clinical measure anyone had. And there was, unmistakably, someone in there following instructions. Understanding language, choosing deliberately to imagine one thing instead of another, on command, to prove it. A woman the world had already filed under Nobody Home was, in that moment, doing the mental equivalent of knocking on the inside of the glass. Owen has since suggested, based on further work with other patients, that a meaningful fraction of people given vegetative state diagnoses, he's used figures in the range of 15 to 20% in interviews, may have some degree of covert awareness trapped behind the same wall. I want to flag that clearly. That specific number is his own estimate, stated in interviews, not an independently nailed-down statistic, and I'm giving it to you exactly that way. But even without leaning on the precise figure, the core finding stands on its own, published and replicated. Some fraction of people diagnosed as having no inner life at all have one, fully intact, with no way to signal it except through a machine built specifically to go looking. Now, I want to be exactly as careful here as the situation demands, because this is the hinge the entire video turns on, and I don't want you to walk away with the wrong lesson. It would be easy to hear this story and think, see, we found a way to detect consciousness after all. We didn't. What Owen's scanner found was a correlate, a pattern of blood flow and brain activation that, in every conscious person ever tested, shows up alongside the experience of imagining tennis. It is extraordinarily strong evidence. It is, honestly, about as strong as evidence gets in this entire domain. But it is still not the experience itself. The scanner never touched what it felt like, from the inside, to imagine that racket in her hand. It touched the shadow that feeling reliably casts on brain tissue. A remarkably reliable shadow, but a shadow. Think of it as the difference between a weather forecast and the actual rain. A good forecast can be right 99 times out of 100. You can plan your whole day around it, trust it, act on it without hesitation. But the forecast is not the rain. It's a correlate of the rain, built from patterns that tend to precede it. Owen's scan is the best forecast anyone has ever built for consciousness. It is still, categorically, not the rain. This is exactly the distinction I promised to keep sharp rather than let blur, because it's where sloppy thinking creeps in on this topic. Strong evidence is not the same thing as logical proof. Owen's work closes an enormous, life-changing gap in medicine. Families got real answers, patients got real diagnoses corrected, real lives were changed by that scanner. It does not, and structurally cannot, close the philosophical gap Chalmers is pointing at. You can build the best forecast in human history and still never once touch a drop of actual rain. And if that's true, even with a brain scanner pointed directly at someone's skull, hunting specifically for signs of awareness, what does that tell you about the far cruder tool you use on the people around you every day? A glance, a tone of voice, the particular way someone's face moves when they say they love you. If Owen's instrument, purpose-built and clinically validated, only ever reaches the forecast and never the rain, your eyes watching a face across a dinner table were never going to reach further than that either. There's an even stranger wrinkle to this, and it doesn't come from a coma ward. It comes from otherwise healthy people, wide awake, walking around, talking to their families every day. In the 1960s and 70s, a neuroscientist named Roger Sperry, along with his student Michael Gazzaniga, studied a group of patients who'd undergone a specific kind of surgery to control severe epilepsy. Surgeons had cut the corpus callosum, the thick bundle of fibers connecting the brain's left and right hemispheres, essentially disconnecting the two halves of the brain from each other to stop seizures from spreading between them. What they found, once they started testing these patients carefully, is one of the strangest results in the history of neuroscience, and I don't think it gets enough attention outside of textbooks. Here's how the test worked. Because of how human vision is wired, information shown only to the left side of a person's visual field goes exclusively to the right hemisphere of the brain. In someone with an intact brain, that information immediately crosses over and gets shared with the left hemisphere too, the half that in most people handles speech. But in a split-brain patient, that crossing over cable has been cut. So if you flash a word or an image only to the left visual field, only the right hemisphere sees it, and the right hemisphere, in most people, can't talk. Researchers would flash a simple image, say, a spoon, only to the patient's left visual field, ask the patient out loud what they saw, and they'd say, nothing. I didn't see anything. Their speaking hemisphere, genuinely, had no idea an image had been shown. But then ask that same patient to reach under a screen with their left hand, the hand controlled by the same hemisphere that did see the spoon, and pick out what they saw from a set of objects by feel alone. Their left hand would go straight for the spoon, every time. Sit with that for a second, because it's genuinely bizarre once you picture it happening in front of you. One human being, one skull, one continuous sense of being a single person. And in that moment, one part of that person's brain knew something. had processed an image, formed a judgment, acted on it correctly with real precision, while the part of the same brain doing the talking insisted, with complete sincerity, that nothing had happened at all. Not lying, not guessing. Genuinely unaware of what its other half already knew and had already acted on. Whether this means there were, in that moment, two separate streams of consciousness running in one head, two small, independent someones sharing a body, is genuinely disputed. And I want to be honest that plenty of serious neuroscientists and philosophers push back on that stronger reading. What isn't disputed, what's been replicated for decades, is the raw finding underneath it. Verbal report and actual processing can come apart inside a single brain in a being you would have sworn, right up until the test, had exactly one unified mind behind its eyes. Why does that matter for the question of other minds? Because it knocks out one of the quiet assumptions you're probably still carrying from earlier in this video. The assumption that at least verbal report, at least what a person tells you about their own experience, is a reasonably solid signal. Split-brain patients show you a case where it flatly isn't. A person can sincerely report, "I saw nothing," while a hand in front of them proves otherwise. If a person's own account of their own mind can be that disconnected from what's actually happening inside their own skull, you should probably lower your confidence even further in how well anyone's outward account, words, expressions, reactions, reflects whatever is actually happening inside somebody else's. I want to shift now from brains to something newer, something a lot of you have probably talked to this week without thinking twice about it. In 1980, a philosopher named John Searle published a thought experiment that's still argued about today, more than 4 decades later, with no sign of resolving. He called it the Chinese room, and I want to walk you through it slowly because the setup matters. Imagine a man sitting alone in a sealed room. He does not speak or read a word of Chinese. Slips of paper covered in Chinese characters get passed to him through a slot in the wall. He has, sitting on a desk in front of him, an enormous rule book written in his own language that tells him, "When you see this particular shape, write down that particular shape in response." He doesn't know what any of it means. He's not translating. He's matching patterns to other patterns, mechanically, according to the rules in the book. He follows the instructions. He passes his response back out through the slot, and to someone outside the room, a native Chinese speaker, say, sliding questions in and reading answers coming back out, the conversation looks completely fluent. Coherent questions get coherent, appropriate answers. As far as the person outside can tell, they're talking to someone who understands Chinese. But inside the room, there is no understanding. There's a man who doesn't know what a single character means, mechanically following a rule book. Searle's argument is that this is exactly what a computer program does, no matter how sophisticated. Manipulate symbols according to rules without ever grasping what any of the symbols mean. Passing every behavioral test for understanding while containing zero understanding. This paper didn't quietly join a shelf somewhere. It was published alongside 27 separate formal responses from other researchers, all published in the same issue, all disagreeing with him in different ways. And the argument now called the system's reply is probably the most famous of them. It says, sure, the man in the room doesn't understand Chinese, but maybe the room does. The man, plus the rulebook, plus the whole system working together, is the thing that understands, even if no single piece of it does on its own. Searle has his own answer to that objection, and the debate has kept going, essentially unbroken, for 45 years. I'm not going to pretend there's a winner. There isn't. What I want you to notice is what this debate actually is. Not a dusty philosophy department argument, but a live, unresolved dispute among the actual people building artificial intelligence today. About systems some of you are talking to on your phone this week. Picture the room itself for a second, because I think the image does something the abstract argument can't. A slot in a wall, questions going in, perfect answers coming out. And you, standing outside, have absolutely no way to see what's happening on the other side of that wall, whether there's a mind matching meaning to meaning or a man with a rulebook matching shape to shape, with no comprehension at all. From where you're standing, the wall's the whole problem. You never get to open the door. Now, hold that room in your mind and walk it forward to June 2014, 60 years to the month after Alan Turing died. Turing was the mathematician who, back in 1950, proposed an informal test for machine intelligence. If a person chatting with something can't reliably tell whether they're talking to a machine or a human, that's a meaningful bar cleared. At an event marking that anniversary, a chatbot built to simulate a 13-year-old Ukrainian boy named Eugene Gustman took part in a series of 5-minute text conversations with human judges. By the end, 33% of the judges were convinced they'd been talking to an actual human being. The event's organizer, a scientist named Kevin Warwick, declared that the bar Turing had floated had officially been passed. It didn't take long for the celebration to collapse into an argument. Critics pointed out, fairly bluntly, that the young, non-native English speaker persona was doing an enormous amount of quiet work. It gave the program a built-in excuse for every strange phrasing, every dodged question, every grammatical stumble a judge might otherwise have caught. It wasn't obviously demonstrating understanding. It was demonstrating a clever way to lower everyone's expectations before the conversation even started. I actually find this case a little bit funny, in a dark way, and I think it's worth letting it be funny for a second, because underneath the comedy it's making exactly Searle's point, playing out in the real world, decades after he wrote it down. A machine fooled real human judges into believing something was home, and nothing whatsoever was settled by that. Passing a conversation is a behavioral test. Behavioral tests we've now seen from 3 completely different directions. A philosopher's thought experiment, a coma ward, a chatbot competition can be passed by systems with nothing behind them at all, or failed by minds that are fully present and simply can't get a signal out. The test and the truth were never actually connected in the first place. And this isn't a historical curiosity from 2014, it's more urgent now than it was then. In the years since, conversational systems have gotten dramatically more capable. Fluent, responsive, able to hold a sustained conversation that would clear Turing's original bar without breaking a sweat. Which means we are now, as a species, mass-producing systems specifically engineered to behave as though something is home. And we still possess exactly 0 ways to check whether anything actually is. Not a worse method than we had before. The same method. 0. I want to bring one more thought experiment into this because it comes at the exact same wall from a completely different direction, and I think the more angles you see it from, the harder it is to look away from. This one belongs to a philosopher named Frank Jackson, first laid out in a 1982 paper and expanded a few years later. Imagine a scientist named Mary. Mary has lived her entire life inside a room with no color in it at all. Black, white, and shades of gray, floor to ceiling, including a screen she uses to study the world outside. And Mary has used that confinement to become the greatest expert on color vision who has ever lived. She knows every physical fact there is to know about what happens when light of a particular wavelength hits a human eye. She knows the exact neural pathway that gets triggered. She knows precisely which brain regions activate and how. There is no physical fact about the experience of seeing red that Mary does not already know, in exhaustive, complete detail. One day, she's let out of the room, and for the first time in her life, she sees a red apple. Jackson's question is simple. Does she learn something new in that moment? Not a new fact about wavelengths. She already had every one of those. Something else. The actual experience of redness, the felt quality of it, as opposed to the description of it. Jackson originally argued, yes, obviously she does. And if she learns something new despite already possessing every physical fact, then the physical facts alone were never the whole story. There was always something left over that no amount of third-person description could capture. I want to give you the honest coda here, because it matters for how much weight to put on this one. Jackson himself later changed his mind and moved away from this argument, eventually becoming a physicalist who no longer thought it proved what he'd once argued it proved. Even the argument's own author came to doubt it. I think that's worth knowing, not as a way of dismissing the thought experiment, but as a reminder of just how genuinely unsettled this entire territory is. Unsettled enough that the people building these arguments sometimes end up arguing with their own younger selves. But set the ending aside for a second and just feel the shape of the thought experiment itself. Because I think it's doing something Chalmers' zombie and Searle's room don't quite do. It's not about someone else's mind at all. It's about the gap between knowing everything about a mind from the outside, every fact, every pathway, every mechanism, total and complete, and knowing what it's actually like on the inside. And that is precisely the gap sitting between you and every other person you have ever met. You don't even have Mary's complete physical knowledge of the people in your life. You have a face, a voice, a pattern of behavior over years, and even if you had everything Mary had, the full physical truth down to the last neuron, Jackson's thought experiment suggests that still might not be enough to cross the gap. There would still be a locked door. You just have a much better description of what was probably behind it. So let's put it all in one room together, because up to this point I've been walking you through these one at a time. And something happens when you stop treating them as separate cases and see them as one thing. 3 completely different fields, working with completely different tools, aimed at completely different problems, arrived at the exact same wall. Epistemology got there first, centuries ago, through pure reasoning. Descartes stripping away every belief he owned until only his own certainty of his own mind was left standing, with everyone else stranded outside it. Neuroscience got there next, but through instruments, not arguments. Owen's scanner finding a woman fully aware behind a diagnosis of nothing, and finding her only by way of a correlate, a shadow, never the thing itself. And now, artificial intelligence has arrived at the identical wall, from the opposite direction entirely, not by failing to build something convincing, but by succeeding so completely at building something convincing that the convincingness itself stopped meaning anything. None of these fields were trying to agree with each other. A 17th century philosopher doubting his senses by candlelight has nothing to do with a chatbot in 2014 pretending to be a Ukrainian teenager. And yet they hit the same floor from 3 unrelated directions for what turns out to be the same underlying reason. Every one of them, whether working with pure logic, brain tissue, or lines of code, only ever had access to the outside of a mind. Never the inside, not once, not anywhere, not with any tool anyone has built or can currently imagine building. Here's the part that genuinely unsettled me when it finally clicked, and I want to say it as plainly as I can. This isn't 3 separate problems that happen to rhyme. It's one problem, wearing 3 different costumes. The philosopher's zombie, the coma patient's silent awareness, the man in the sealed room with his rulebook, they're all the identical shape. Something producing every observable sign of a mind, with the observer permanently locked out of knowing whether a mind is actually the thing producing it. Think about the puppet show for a second. One where you've bought a ticket, taken your seat, and watched a performance so seamless, so responsive, so alive that you never once thought to check backstage. The strings move exactly the way a living hand would move them. The characters react in real time, adjust to the room, seem to actually feel the story they're telling. You've been watching your entire life, and you have never once gone backstage. Not for your closest friend, not for your parents, not for yourself as anyone else would need to check you. Everyone in your life is a performance you've never once verified from behind the curtain. And here's the twist the puppet show can't quite capture on its own. You have no idea whether there even is a backstage. You've just always assumed the curtain leads somewhere. I said earlier I'd come back to solipsism properly, and this is the moment to do it, because now you have everything you need to actually feel why it's strange rather than just hear that it is. Solipsism is the position that only your own mind can be known with certainty to exist. Everyone else, everything else, might, for all you can prove, be unconscious scenery, extremely convincing scenery, built by physics to move and talk and love you back, but nobody home behind any of it. Here's the claim I made you sit with before we got here. Nobody has ever logically refuted solipsism. Not Descartes, not Mill, not Chalmers, not Dennett, not one philosopher in centuries of trying. It cannot be disproven by argument alone from the inside of a single mind that only ever has access to itself. That's not a controversial thing to say. It's close to a logical fact about the structure of the problem. And yet, and here's the genuinely strange part, the part I promised was stranger than the position itself. Essentially, nobody actually believes it. Nobody lives as though their mother is a puppet. Nobody treats their closest friend's grief as an empty performance. Even the philosophers who can construct the airtight argument for solipsism go home at night and love people, trust people, grieve for people, exactly as if the diary were unlocked after all. Sit with that gap for a second, because I think it's the real payload of this whole video, more than any single thought experiment on its own. Here is a position that cannot be refuted by logic, and virtually no one adopts it anyway. That should tell you something important, and it's not that the logic is broken. It's that belief in other minds was never actually running on logic in the first place. It's running on something else. The argument from analogy, yes, but underneath that, something closer to a decision. A choice, repeated every single day, usually without ever noticing you're making it, to treat the diary as though it were open, the room as though someone were inside it, the puppet as though there really is a hand and a heartbeat behind the curtain. I want to be completely fair here, the way the best thinkers on this subject are fair to each other, because it would be dishonest to leave you thinking the skeptical position is somehow the smart one and everyone else is just naively refusing to look at the evidence. It isn't, and they're not. The argument from analogy that Mill laid out is not a consolation prize handed to people too scared to face solipsism head-on. It is, genuinely, the most reasonable belief available to any mind in your position. You share a nervous system built by the same evolutionary process as everyone around you. You share the biology that produces pain behavior when there's pain, joy behavior when there's joy. Every single person you've ever watched cry at a funeral, laugh at a memory, flinch from a hot stove, has done so in exactly the circumstances where, if they were built the way you're built, you'd expect them to be having an experience. Treating that as solid, actionable, entirely rational grounds for belief is not a failure of philosophical nerve. It is philosophy working correctly. Nobody who actually understands this problem, including the people who've spent entire careers on it, walks away and lives as a solipsist. That fact belongs in this video as much as the doubt does. The two are supposed to sit side by side, uncomfortably, and neither one is allowed to cancel the other out. But notice what kind of ground that leaves you standing on. Not proof, not certainty. A bet, well placed, backed by everything reasonable, and still, structurally, permanently, a bet. Every relationship you have ever had, every act of love or trust or grief you've ever extended toward another human being, has been extended across a gap that cannot be closed on the strength of evidence that can never be more than very good. Now, turn all of this back on yourself, because that's where it actually has to land. You've spent this entire video hearing about other people, Kate Bainbridge, the split-brain patients, the man in the sealed room, a scientist named Mary trapped with her books. It's easy to hold all of that at arm's length as a fascinating problem about other people's minds. I want to close that distance now, because the coldest version of this isn't about them. It's about the person sitting closest to you tonight, the one whose voice you know without thinking, whose face you'd recognize in a crowd of thousands, who has told you more than once exactly how they feel about you. Every word of that came to you across the same locked wall as everyone else. You have never once gotten behind it. Not with them, not with anyone, not one single time in your entire life. And here's the part that turns it inward instead of outward. The part I think is the real floor dropping out. You cannot even offer them proof in return. Whatever is happening behind your own eyes right now, as you hear this, however certain you are that it's real, that it's yours, that there's genuinely someone in here, there is no experiment you could run, no scan, no test that would let another person confirm it from where they're standing. You are, to every single person who has ever loved you, exactly the same locked diary they are to you. They took you on faith. They made the bet. Every single day, without proof, they decided to believe there was somebody home behind your eyes too. Let me take you back to Kate Bainbridge for a moment, because there's a piece of her story I held back, and it belongs here. Not at the start. She recovered. Not completely, not quickly, but enough, over time, to eventually describe what those months had actually been like from the inside. And one detail from her account has stayed with me since I first read it. When the scan finally showed what was happening in her mind, she described the feeling, in her own words, as being found. Not rescued in the dramatic sense. Found. Like someone had finally looked in the right place after searching the wrong one for a very long time. Think about what that word is doing. It means that up until that scanner turned on, she existed, fully as a person with thoughts and fears and a sense of who she was. And as far as the world was concerned, she simply wasn't there to be found. Her mind was real the entire time. Her mind's reality was not in question. What was missing was a channel, a signal strong enough to reach anyone standing outside her. I want you to notice what that does to the whole shape of this problem, because it's easy to slide into thinking the lesson here is we need better scanners, build a good enough machine, and eventually the wall comes down. That's not quite it, and it's worth being precise about why. Owen's scanner didn't reach into Kate Bainbridge's experience and touch it. It found a signal she was capable of generating. Imagine tennis, imagine walking through your house, and match that signal against a known pattern from other conscious brains. It was still, in the end, a very sophisticated version of Mill's argument from analogy. This activation looks like the activation in a mind I already know is conscious, therefore, probably there's a mind here too. The forecast got extraordinarily good. It never once became the rain. That's worth sitting with in practical terms because it changes what better technology can and can't promise you. Imagine the most advanced possible scanner, decades from now, capable of mapping every neuron, every synapse, every firing pattern in a living human brain in real time with perfect resolution. What would it actually give you? A complete map of the wiring, the whole diagram, no piece missing. And Frank Jackson's scientist, Mary, already showed you the limit of that kind of achievement. She had the complete physical picture of color vision exhaustively, and something was still missing until she opened her eyes to an actual apple. A perfect scanner gives you a perfect version of Mary's black and white room. It cannot, structurally, hand you what it's like to be the person you're scanning. No matter how good the wiring diagram gets, the diagram was never going to be the light. I think this is why the newest chapter of this story, the one still being written right now this year, feels different in tone from the older philosophical debates. Searle's rulebook in a sealed room was, for most of the last 40 years, a thought experiment, something to imagine. It is not a thought experiment anymore. You can open your phone tonight and have a conversation in real time with something that responds to nuance, remembers what you said earlier, adjusts its tone, seems in every observable way to be following what you're saying and caring about the answer. It will pass without strain the kind of casual test that made headlines in 2014 when a chatbot pretending to be a teenager barely scraped through. These systems now clear that bar so easily it isn't even considered noteworthy. Think of it as a stunt double standing in for an actor in a film, filmed at the right distance in the right light, moving the right way. A good stunt double is completely indistinguishable from the star of the picture. The audience never questions it. That's the whole job, to be so convincing that nobody backstage even needs to ask which one is on screen. Now imagine you could never see the film crew, never see behind the camera, never get the footage stopped and rewound. All you'd ever have is the performance itself, running forever, with no way to check who, or what, is actually inside the costume. That is, right now, tonight, the exact situation you are in with a machine that talks to you like a friend. And it is, structurally, no different from the situation you have always been in with every human being you've ever met. The only thing that changed is that we built something that makes the gap between performance in person impossible to ignore. I don't say this to frighten you about artificial intelligence specifically. That's not actually the point, and I don't want you to leave this video thinking it is. I say it because it's forcing a question, out in the open, that used to be easy to leave in the background of your life. For most of human history, everything that talked back to you, responded to you, seemed to care about you, was a person, built the way you're built, sharing your biology, which made Mill's argument from analogy feel, in daily life, close enough to certainty that nobody thought about the gap underneath it. That comfortable overlap is gone now. We are, this year, mass-producing convincing performances with no biological kinship to lean on at all. Which means the question this video is actually asking, how do you know anyone is really in there, isn't a historical curiosity from a 17th century philosopher's study anymore. It's a live question you are going to keep running into more and more for the rest of your life, every single time you open a screen. Here's a place I want to push a little further than I have so far, because I think it's the most honest way to feel the size of this gap rather than just hear about its size. Think about the specific moments in your life where another person's inner reality mattered more to you than almost anything else. Somebody looking you in the eyes and telling you, for the first time, that they loved you. A parent sitting on the edge of your bed as a child, telling you everything was going to be fine. A doctor or someone standing in for one, delivering news that changed the shape of your life, and you searching their face for whether they actually meant what they were saying, or were just saying the thing they were trained to say. In every one of those moments, what you were actually doing, what anyone does in that position, is reading a performance for signs of a mind behind it. The tremor in a voice. The specific way eyes well up instead of just producing tears on cue. A hesitation before speaking, as if the words had to travel some distance before they arrived. None of that is direct access. All of it is exactly the same category of evidence as Owen's scanner lighting up in a pattern that resembles a conscious brain. A correlate, a very good one, built from years of learning what real feeling tends to look like from the outside, and still, at bottom, an inference. You have never once, not in the most important moment of your life, gotten past the outside of another person. You got very, very good at reading it. That is not the same thing as reaching through it. And here's the piece I don't think gets said often enough, so I want to say it plainly. This cuts in both directions, and the second direction is arguably heavier than the first. It's easy to spend a video like this one worrying about whether the people around you are really in there. It's much harder and much stranger to sit with the mirror version of that question, whether you have ever actually managed to prove it to them. Every reassurance you've ever given someone you love, every "I'm fine," every "I understand exactly how you feel," every time you told someone their pain mattered to you and you meant it with everything you had, none of that ever crossed the wall either. It traveled outward from you exactly the way everyone else's signals travel outward toward you, as behavior, as tone, as words shaped by an experience they could never directly check. You have spent your entire life being taken on faith by the very people you were worried you might be taking on faith. The uncertainty was never a one-way street pointed outward from you at the world. It runs in both directions through every relationship you have ever had, silently, the entire time. There's an image for this that I think is sharper than any of the others I've given you so far, because it doesn't just describe the gap, it describes why the gap is impossible to inspect from outside itself. Imagine a mirror hung on a wall, and every single test you could ever design to check whether another mind is real has to be looked at, interpreted, and judged by you using your own mind before it means anything at all. There's no neutral referee you can call in. No third position outside both minds where the comparison could happen cleanly. Every scanner reading, every conversation, every tearful confession gets funneled back through the one instrument you can never step outside of, your own awareness checking itself forever. You can angle the mirror however you like. It only ever shows you your own face looking back. That's not a flaw in the experiments. It's not a flaw in Owen's methodology, or in the split brain research, or in anything philosophy has tried across 4 centuries of effort. It's a structural feature of what it means to be a single mind trying to verify another one. There is no outside the mirror to stand in. There never was. I want to go back for a moment to something I said near the start almost in passing, because I don't think I gave it its full weight yet, and it deserves it. Your access to your own mental states is direct and immediate. You don't infer your own pain, you simply have it instantly, with no gap between the having and the knowing. It's tempting to treat that as a kind of consolation prize. At least I've got myself, at least one mind in this whole uncertain arrangement, is fully, permanently secured. But even that certainty is narrower than it first appears, and it's worth being precise about exactly how narrow. What you have direct, non-inferential access to is only the present instant, this feeling right now as it's happening. The moment it's gone, everything you know about it becomes a memory. And a memory is a report generated by your own brain about a state that no longer exists to be checked. You don't have live, ongoing access to who you were an hour ago or who you were as a child. You have a story your mind tells you about that person, built the same general way, structurally, as the story you build about anyone else's inner life. The privileged access Descartes secured for you was never a lifetime pass. It was a single ticket, valid for the present moment only, over and over again, moment after moment, each one gone the instant the next one arrives. Go back to the room where we started. Kate Bainbridge, lying in that bed, aware the entire time, with no way to prove it to a single person standing over her. I told you that story to unsettle you about the people around you. I want to end by turning it the other way. Because the truth is, you have been Kate Bainbridge to everyone who has ever loved you. Every one of them stood outside the wall around your mind, exactly the way the doctor stood outside hers, reading a face, a voice, a set of behaviors, and choosing without proof to believe that someone was in there. They were right. You know they were right, the way you know nothing else in this world. But they never got to know it. They only ever got to believe it, and go on loving you anyway. That's the whole trade, in the end. Not a flaw in how we know each other. The only way there has ever been. You will go home tonight to people you cannot prove are real, and who cannot prove you're real to them, and you will hold their hands and mean it, and they will hold yours back and mean it too, and neither of you will ever be able to close the distance between you by so much as an inch. And somehow, knowing that, you'll do it again tomorrow. Everyone who has ever loved you did the same thing, every day, without proof, until the day they died. I don't have a way to make that feeling go away, and I'm not sure I'd want to if I could. Maybe that's the part worth sitting with, longer than anything else in this video. The certainty was never the point. The choosing was.